On December 29, 2025, China launched what would become the largest military exercise around Taiwan in recorded history. 130 aircraft, 14 warships, 14 Coast Guard vessels, all moving in coordinated patterns around the island simultaneously. Every major headline called it a show of force, a provocation, a military drill. They all use the same frame. But here's the problem. Every single one of those headlines missed the most important part of what China actually did that day. This was not a rehearsal for an invasion. It wasn't even a rehearsal for a traditional military blockade of the island. What China rehearsed on December 29th was something far more surgical, far more legally sophisticated, and far more dangerous. They rehearsed a quarantine. And the difference between a quarantine and a blockade is not a matter of semantics. That gap between those two words may determine whether the United States responds with military force or gets legally paralyzed, trying to decide if it even can. That distinction is what this entire video is about, because it changes everything about how you read the situation in the Taiwan Strait right now. If you understand what China actually rehearsed that day, you understand the future of Taiwan, the global semiconductor industry, and the Western alliance system. Let's start with the raw scale of what happened, because the numbers alone deserve a moment of attention before we go further. The exercise, officially named the December 2025 exercises by the PLA Eastern Theater Command, covered a larger geographic footprint than any Chinese drill since August 2022. According to Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, 90 of those 130 aircraft crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait on that single day. Not 10 aircraft crossing that invisible boundary, not 30, 90, in a matter of hours. That is not a number you see in routine signaling operations, but the detail that every serious analyst zeroed in on immediately was not the aircraft count. It was the 14 China Coast Guard vessels operating alongside the military. Coast Guard ships are not warships under international law. They are law enforcement vessels operating under an entirely different legal framework. And that legal distinction is not an accident or an oversight. It is the core architecture of the strategy China spent December 29th rehearsing. On January 2nd, 2026, the Institute for the Study of War and the American Enterprise Institute published their joint assessment of the exercises. Their conclusion was direct. Justice Mission 2025 was designed as a rehearsal for what defense analysts are now calling a law enforcement-led quarantine of Taiwan. Here is what that means in practice, and why it is so structurally different from anything China has attempted before in this region. A traditional military blockade is an act of war under international law. The moment PLA Navy ships physically stop a commercial vessel, China commits an act of aggression that triggers treaty obligations, that forces every nation to choose a side publicly and immediately. That is a line China has so far been unwilling to visibly cross. A quarantine led by Coast Guard forces, framed as domestic law enforcement, described as safety inspections within waters Beijing claims, does none of those things automatically. It forces Washington and its allies to answer a question with no clean answer. Is this a war, or is this a law enforcement operation inside claimed sovereign territory? According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a quarantine does not need to stop every ship entering Taiwanese waters to be strategically effective. It only needs to raise the perceived risk of interference high enough that insurers, shipping companies, and port operators decide the route is commercially unstable. When that calculation shifts in the minds of the shipping industry, Taiwan begins to choke, not from a military siege, but from a quiet, legally ambiguous economic squeeze. And here is the critical point. The alliance system the United States built after World War II was not designed to respond to that kind of pressure. It was built for the other kind. That is the gap China is exploiting. And Justice Mission 2025, in the view of multiple defense institutions, was the most detailed rehearsal of that exploitation to date. War on the Rocks published a detailed analysis on February 7th, 2026, noting that the most consequential feature of the drills was not their size, it was their character. The exercises did not emphasize amphibious landing scenarios. There was no simulation of a beach assault or rapid ground campaign. The emphasis was on encirclement and interdiction, coordinated integration of naval, air, rocket, and Coast Guard forces into what the analysis described as a full-spectrum quarantine rehearsal across all domains simultaneously. In my view, that shift in emphasis tells you something critical about how Beijing has updated its strategic thinking over the past 2 years of internal deliberation. An invasion of Taiwan carries enormous risk and is almost certain to trigger a direct military confrontation with the United States and its regional allies, including Japan. But a quarantine, conducted gradually, framed as legal enforcement, led by Coast Guard vessels rather than warships, creates a completely different decision tree for Washington. It creates what analysts at War on the Rocks described as a gap between market speed and coalition speed. And that gap is where the real strategic damage gets done. Financial markets respond to uncertainty in hours. International coalitions respond in weeks or months. Inside that gap, enormous damage can occur before anyone fires a shot. This is the architecture China spent December 29th perfecting, and it explains why the mainstream framing of military drill completely misses what is actually being built here. Now, before we go deeper into exactly how this quarantine strategy works and what makes Taiwan uniquely, almost catastrophically vulnerable to it, let's pause here. If you're watching this and thinking, I've never heard this framing before, that is precisely the point. The quarantine concept is central to every serious defense think tank right now. It is almost completely absent from mainstream news coverage. And that gap between what the analysts are saying and what the headlines are showing is worth paying attention to. If this framing concerns you, hit the like button and drop a comment below. What do you think China's actual endgame is here? Is this about Taiwan, or is it about something much larger? I read every comment, and your perspective genuinely shapes what we cover next. Because in part 2, we are going to get into the number that puts everything in context, a number that makes the oil fields of the Middle East look almost small by comparison. That number is 92, and once you understand what it represents, this story gets a great deal more serious. Here's a number that should stop you cold. 92. That is the percentage of the world's most advanced semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan. Not 30%, not 50%. 92% of the chips that power every AI system, every fighter jet's avionics, every smartphone on the planet. According to the Pacific Forum and multiple industry research groups, Taiwan produces 92% of chips manufactured at the most advanced process nodes. For context, TSMC alone controlled over 70% of total global foundry revenue by the second quarter of 2025, according to TrendForce, a new all-time record. Apple's chips, NVIDIA's AI accelerators, AMD's processors, Qualcomm's mobile silicon. Every single one of them is made in Taiwan by TSMC at facilities that cannot be quickly relocated. This is the number that explains why the quarantine strategy is so much more dangerous than a conventional military threat, and why Beijing clearly understands this better than most. Here's the core problem. Semiconductors are not like oil. You cannot just reroute a tanker or tap a strategic reserve when the supply gets cut. Building a leading-edge semiconductor fab, a facility capable of manufacturing chips at 3 nanometers or below, takes between 5 and 10 years from groundbreaking to first production wafer. It requires billions of dollars in specialized equipment, much of which is produced by only 1 or 2 companies globally, including ASML in the Netherlands with its EUV lithography machines. And it requires a workforce with a very specific combination of skills that has taken Taiwan decades to build, skills that cannot be transferred or replicated in a few years anywhere else on Earth. TSMC itself has made this reality impossible to ignore. When it began building its Arizona fab with US government backing and tens of billions in CHIPS Act subsidies, the timeline and cost were sobering. The Arizona facility, producing chips at 4 nanometers, which is already a generation behind TSMC's most advanced Taiwan processes, faces costs 4 to 5 times higher than equivalent production in Taiwan. TSMC publicly stated that construction costs in the US are dramatically higher, skilled workers are harder to find, and the facility will not reach full advanced node production until 2027 or 2028 at the earliest. In other words, even with the full weight of the US government behind the effort, America's backup plan for Taiwanese chips is years away and significantly more expensive. Now, put that reality next to a quarantine scenario. A 2025 scenario analysis from Taiwan's Social Resilience Research Center, published through the SSRN academic database, reached a direct conclusion. Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain would be particularly vulnerable to a quarantine initiated before 2027, before the first meaningful alternative production capacity comes fully online anywhere in the world. The researchers used tabletop exercise methodology, the same approach used by the RAND Corporation and the U.S. Department of Defense for scenario planning, and the findings were consistent. High relocation costs, the difficulty of training qualified workers, and Taiwan's limited strategic reserves of industrial gases make the island acutely exposed to a prolonged supply disruption. This is not a distant hypothetical. The RAND Corporation ran its own tabletop exercise with U.S. government and business leaders specifically focused on a Chinese coercive quarantine of Taiwan. The scenarios they tested included both a contested and an uncontested quarantine. The outcomes in both cases were described in RAND's own language as an extended economic depression for most of the world. Think about what that phrase means coming from RAND. Not a recession, not a slowdown. An extended economic depression for most of the world. That is the framing of an institution that chooses its words carefully. And here is what makes this strategically elegant from Beijing's perspective. China itself depends heavily on TSMC's chips right now for many of its commercial and industrial products. A military invasion that destroys Taiwan's fabs is something Beijing has repeatedly signaled it wants to avoid, not just for international optics, but because of the economic self-destruction it would cause. A quarantine that applies pressure without destroying infrastructure changes everything. Coercing Taiwan while leaving the fabs intact potentially gives China control over 92% of global advanced chip production. The RAND tabletop exercise captured this scenario precisely. A quarantine that meets no meaningful resistance gives China leverage over the global chip supply chain that no nation in history has ever held. That leverage would not just affect military hardware procurement cycles. It would affect the ability of the United States and its allies to develop and deploy artificial intelligence at a competitive pace. Every AI system, every autonomous weapons platform, every next-generation network runs on chips. Controlling who gets those chips, and at what price, is structural power that transcends military dominance. In my view, this is what mainstream analysis underweights on Taiwan. The conversation defaults to asking, will China invade, when the more strategically important question is actually something quite different. Does China even need to invade to achieve its core strategic objectives? If a quarantine can sustain enough economic pressure and legal ambiguity for long enough, the answer to that question may simply be no. This is why December 29th matters so much. China did not just rehearse military encirclement that day. It rehearsed how to make the economic cost of Western inaction rival the military cost of actual intervention. That is a fundamentally different strategic challenge than the one Western alliance planners have been preparing for since the 1990s, and it is one for which, right now in February 2026, no fully formed playbook exists. The U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act commits Washington to providing Taiwan with defensive arms and maintaining the capacity to resist any resort to force. But it says nothing about Coast Guard inspections in disputed waters. What triggers a formal U.S. military response, and whether a legally ambiguous quarantine crosses that threshold, is being actively debated by analysts from Washington to Tokyo right now. And that debate is happening in real time, in a world where TSMC's facilities in Taiwan produced over $30 billion worth of chips in a single quarter of 2025, and where global demand is only accelerating. The global semiconductor industry is on track to surpass $1 trillion in annual sales in 2026. A meaningful disruption to Taiwan's output would not just affect that number, it would shatter it. Next, we are going to examine the specific military and legal mechanics of how a quarantine actually works, and why the timeline problem the U.S. faces is far more compressed than most analysts publicly acknowledge. Here is what a quarantine of Taiwan actually looks like on day one, not in a war game, not in a think tank simulation, in practice. China does not announce a blockade. China does not close the Taiwan Strait. China does not fire a single missile. Instead, Beijing releases a statement. The statement says that, effective immediately, all cargo and tanker vessels entering Taiwanese ports must file advanced customs declarations with relevant Chinese maritime authorities. No military language, no threats. Just a new administrative requirement framed as a regulatory update to maritime traffic management in waters China claims jurisdiction over. Jurisdiction. That is Scenario 1 from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. September 2024 report, How China Could Quarantine Taiwan, mapping out 2 possible scenarios. The CSIS China Power Project spent months on this analysis, combining tabletop exercises, private consultations with government officials, and surveys of regional security experts. Their conclusion was striking. A quarantine is not just more feasible than an invasion in the near term, it is more likely. And the reason comes down to one word: compliance. China does not need to physically stop every ship. It needs enough shipping companies, insurers, and port operators to decide that compliance is cheaper than resistance. If Beijing can threaten fines, restrict market access, or blacklist companies that defy the new rules, many commercial actors will simply route around Taiwan without China ever deploying a warship. This is how the economic pressure builds without a single shot being fired. And it is precisely the mechanism that makes this strategy so difficult for Western governments to respond to cleanly. The CSIS report outlines 2 distinct quarantine scenarios. The differences between them are important to understand because they represent different levels of escalation and different legal problems. In the first and more limited scenario, China focuses on a single major port, most likely Kaohsiung, Taiwan's largest container terminal and one of the busiest ports in the entire Asia-Pacific region. Coast Guard vessels establish what Beijing describes as an enhanced customs inspection zone. Vessels that comply with the new filing requirements are allowed to proceed. Those that refuse are turned back. No ship is physically sunk or boarded by force. The Coast Guard simply creates enough friction, enough delay, enough uncertainty, that the commercial calculation shifts on its own. In the more aggressive second scenario, the quarantine expands to all major Taiwanese ports at once. The maritime militia joins the Coast Guard, creating a ring around the island that is far harder to challenge legally. The maritime militia is a particularly important element here, and one that most people outside of defense analysis circles are not familiar with. These are not military vessels under international law. They are nominally civilian fishing boats, crewed by personnel connected to the People's Liberation Army, operating in gray zone spaces that military rules of engagement were never written to address. Adding maritime militia to the operation creates what the CSIS researchers describe as a flexible force, one that can scale up or down rapidly based on the level of international resistance China encounters. Now here is where the legal dimension becomes absolutely critical, and where the United States faces a genuinely difficult structural problem that has no simple answer. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the Taiwan Strait is a strait used for international navigation, and all vessels enjoy the right of transit passage through it. That right, codified in Articles 37 and 38 of UNCLOS, is a foundational principle of international maritime law. Under the convention, it cannot be unilaterally suspended by any coastal state. The United States, Japan, Australia, and most Western nations have consistently reaffirmed this position. The Taiwan Strait is an international waterway. Freedom of navigation applies. Full stop. But China's position is different, and it is important to understand exactly what Beijing argues. Not because China is right, but because the legal ambiguity is the weapon. China's foreign ministry has stated that the Taiwan Strait falls within China's territorial sea and exclusive economic zone. Beijing does not accept the characterization of the strait as a simple international waterway. A 2025 legal analysis in the Washington International Law Journal describes China as systematically building what the paper calls a distorted legal narrative around its maritime claims in the strait. The Carnegie Endowment described this in 2023 as China narrowing the functional reach of international law in East Asia, not by formally changing the rules, but by making them harder to enforce in practice. This is the core of the strategic trap. If China frames a quarantine as domestic law enforcement inside waters it claims sovereign jurisdiction over, Washington faces a decision with no clean options on either side. Option 1. The U.S. Navy escorts commercial vessels through the strait, directly challenging China's claimed jurisdiction, a potential military confrontation between two nuclear powers over a legal argument. Option 2, Washington protests diplomatically, imposes sanctions, and calls emergency sessions at the United Nations, while the quarantine continues and Taiwan's economy begins to feel the pressure day by day. Option 3, some combination of both, with allies disagreeing about which response is proportionate and the coalition fracturing in real time, while Beijing watches and adjusts. In my view, this is the most sophisticated aspect of the quarantine strategy. It does not just create a military dilemma, it creates a political and legal dilemma simultaneously inside the same set of events. The United States-Taiwan Relations Act, passed in 1979, commits Washington to providing Taiwan with defensive arms and maintaining the capacity to resist any resort to force or coercion against the island. But a Coast Guard vessel turning back a Taiwanese-bound cargo ship by requiring a filing it knows cannot legally be submitted. That is not a resort to force in any language that triggers automatic treaty obligations. This ambiguity is not accidental. CSIS specifically notes that China's law enforcement framing is designed to minimize international pushback by avoiding language that maps onto established red lines. Beijing does not call it a quarantine or a blockade. It calls it enhanced customs inspection, and every word in that phrase is chosen to maximize legal and political friction for anyone trying to respond. The timeline question matters enormously here, and it connects directly back to the semiconductor issue we discussed earlier. TSMC's first Arizona facility reaches advanced production in 2027 at the earliest. Intel's efforts to rebuild advanced domestic fabrication in the United States remain years from producing chips at competitive scales. Samsung's Taylor, Texas facility has faced repeated delays and cost overruns. This means that between now, February 2026, and roughly 2028, the world has essentially no meaningful backup for Taiwanese semiconductor production if that supply is disrupted for any sustained period. That window is not lost on Beijing. And the December 29th exercises suggest that China is actively calibrating the timing of its pressure campaigns with the global semiconductor supply chain in mind. What this tells us, when you put the legal architecture and the economic timeline together, is that the quarantine strategy has a logic that extends well beyond Taiwan itself. It forces a decision moment for the United States and its allies at precisely the point when the economic cost of resisting is highest and the military cost of intervention is most uncertain. Whether Washington has truly prepared for that combination of pressures is something very few officials have addressed directly. Next, we look at what the actual response options are, and why none of them are clean. Here is what changed the entire strategic equation in November 2025. And the shift did not come from Washington or from any military exercise. On November 7th, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stood before the Diet's Budget Committee and said something no sitting Japanese Prime Minister had ever said publicly before. She stated directly that a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan could constitute what Japanese law defines as a survival-threatening situation for Japan, potentially authorizing military action. That is not a diplomatic statement. That is a legal classification. And in Japan's post-2015 security framework, those words carry precise and binding meaning about when force can be used. The Institute for the Study of Diplomacy published an analysis in December 2025 describing Takaichi's choice of language as defining a potential legal tripwire in the Taiwan Strait. The analysis notes that her framing gives U.S. planners a clearer picture of when Japan could legally move from rear area support into active collective self-defense alongside American forces. China's response was immediate and sharp. Beijing's foreign ministry called the remarks a gross interference in China's internal affairs and demanded a full retraction, which never came. Takaichi doubled down instead. Her approval rating, according to Japanese domestic polls from December 1st, 2025, stood at 75%. Essentially unchanged after the controversy. What this tells you is something important about where Japanese public opinion actually sits on the question of Taiwan right now, heading into 2026. Tokyo also backed its position with substance. Japan committed to reaching 2% of GDP in defense spending 2 years ahead of its original NATO-aligned schedule. Japan unveiled formal civilian evacuation plans for its southwestern island chain in early 2025. TSMC opened its first Japanese fab in Kumamoto in 2024, deepening the economic interdependence. That Kumamoto facility makes a quarantine of Taiwan a direct, immediate threat to Japan's own semiconductor supply chain. Not an abstract geopolitical concern, but a concrete industrial one. In my view, Japan's posture is now the single most important variable in the quarantine deterrence equation, more consequential in some ways than the U.S. military footprint alone. Beijing can model American political will. It has studied Washington's decision-making through decades of crises. Calculating a newly assertive Japan operating under a defined legal framework is considerably harder. The Pentagon's 2025 annual China Military Power Report confirmed that Beijing is developing the capability to fight and win a conflict over Taiwan by 2027. That is the Department of Defense's own assessment. But the same report noted that military capability does not equal intent. RAND's 2025 analysis on Taiwan deterrence found that the most likely Chinese approach remains coercion well below the threshold of open warfare. Those two facts together define the trap that December 29th was designed to rehearse, build the capability to act, then apply pressure just below the line that triggers an automatic response. RAND also found that Allied economic sanctions, widely seen as the primary non-military tool, face a structural problem that rarely gets discussed openly in policy circles. Allies are unlikely to join preemptive economic measures without strong and sustained U.S. leadership. Tokyo can move quickly, technically, but the political decision carries enormous domestic costs. The result is that a Western response to a quarantine would not arrive as a unified coalition on day one. It would arrive fractured at different speeds, with different national red lines. China, which has studied every Western coalition response from Kosovo to Ukraine, understands this fracture point very well, and the quarantine architecture is designed to exploit it precisely. Bloomberg's January 2024 analysis estimated that a full-scale conflict over Taiwan would cost the global economy roughly $10 trillion over several years of disruption. A quarantine that achieves even a fraction of that coercive pressure at a fraction of the cost is, from Beijing's strategic perspective, an extremely attractive option on the risk-reward curve. This is what makes stepping back on February 21st, 2026, and looking at the full picture so important. The Taiwan question has become a systems problem, not a military one or a diplomatic one. It involves maritime law, semiconductor supply chains, coalition decision speeds, and the question of whether rules-based frameworks can respond to coercion specifically designed to avoid triggering them. The December 29th exercises were not a provocation, they were a calibration. China was not signaling anger, it was rehearsing precision. The difference between those two things is exactly what the headline "China conducts military drill" completely fails to capture. And it is what makes this moment more serious than it appears from the outside. The strait is quiet today. The ships are moving. The fabs in Hsinchu and Tainan are running at full capacity, producing the chips that power the global economy. But inside the PLA Eastern Theater Command, analysts reviewed the December 29th footage and asked one question: what needs to be refined before we do this for real? That question has no publicly known answer. The fact that it is being asked, seriously, methodically, is the story. Not the drill, not the aircraft count, not the headline. The world's most consequential supply chain runs through an island of 23 million people in a strait that is now, quietly and deliberately, being rehearsed as a pressure point.